Montana Territory, October 1881. High in the Bitterroot Valley, where the autumn wind bites like broken glass, a 32-year-old widow named Sarah Hendricks did something that made her neighbors stop their wagons in complete disbelief. She started framing heavy pine timbers directly over her existing cabin roof. Not beside it, not behind it, but completely over it. Settlers driving past on the dirt trail pulled their horses to a halt. Some shook their heads in pity. Others burst out laughing right there in their boots. One old-timer leaned over his cart and told his son that the poor woman had lost her mind from grief. Another settler declared loudly that she did not know the first thing about homesteading, putting a barn roof over a house where no livestock would ever stand. They called her project a fool's errand. They called it backwards construction. Calvin Porter, the most respected carpenter in the territory, publicly sneered at her work, calling it a fire trap with a rot problem and coining a phrase that echoed through the general store all month. Building a barn when you need a house is how you freeze in style. Now, picture this. Just 14 months later, by the spring of 1883, 14 homesteading families within 50 miles were quietly copying her exact design. When one of the most ruthless blizzards in Montana history slammed into the territory, dropping temperatures to a bone-chilling -35 degrees Fahrenheit and dumping knee-deep ice and rain across the Terra Valley. Her neighbors were burning through a full cord of firewood every 5 days, suffocating in smoke-filled cabins that barely held 40 degrees. Meanwhile, inside Sarah's home, the air was a comfortable, steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Her children wore lightweight cotton shirts indoors, and her fireplace burned so clean that only a whisper of thin, gray smoke escaped her chimney. Most shocking of all, she had used less than half the fuel of anyone else in the county, with enough bone-dry firewood remaining in her stacks to survive another full winter. What did a widowed mother of two understand about winter survival and thermodynamics that the seasoned frontiersman completely missed? Stay with me here, because the mechanical secret she uncovered inside that outer timber shell humbles every conventional piece of survival advice you have ever heard. If you are fascinated by the tested wisdom of early American pioneers who survived when a single oversight meant death, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and the coldest temperature you have ever faced. Now, let us look at the exact physics of what Sarah built and why it changed frontier architecture forever. To truly understand the brilliance of Sarah's design, you have to look at the sheer brutality of a Montana winter in the late 19th century. In 1881, homesteading was not an off-grid hobby or a romantic lifestyle choice. It was an unyielding game of physical endurance. If your fire went out, your water barrel froze solid inside your kitchen. If your firewood remained damp, your stove produced nothing but thick carbon monoxide, soot, and smoldering ash that drained every ounce of heat from your living space. Sarah Hendricks had not set out to challenge traditional carpentry. She was simply trying to keep her 9-year-old daughter Mary and her 7-year-old son Samuel from freezing to death. Just 6 months earlier, in the spring of 1881, her husband Thomas had been killed instantly when a young plow horse startled and kicked him while clearing their second field of winter wheat. She was left completely alone on an isolated quarter section of land, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor and nearly 20 miles from the nearest trade post. Her shelter was a sturdy 12 by 16-foot log cabin that Thomas had built during their first summer. The cabin itself was well constructed, sitting on a dry stone foundation with notched pine logs, heavy mud chinking, and a solid cedar shake roof. However, their firewood arrangement was a recipe for disaster. Like nearly every settler in the Northern Territories, Thomas had constructed a basic lean-to woodshed against the east wall of the cabin. It had a sloped board roof and 3 open sides. In normal summer conditions, an open lean-to allowed air to circulate across stacked logs. But the northern plains do not offer mild weather when winter approaches. September of 1881 brought torrential cold rain that soaked through the valley for nearly 3 straight weeks. The fierce mountain wind drove rain sideways, soaking deep into the sides of Sarah's woodpile. The rain saturated the bark, penetrated the split seams of the pine and fir logs, and turned 4 cords of hand-split wood into heavy, waterlogged sponges. By early October, every single piece of fuel Sarah possessed was soaked to its core. When she tried to build a fire, the logs hissed and sputtered. Water beaded up on the ends of the timber, boiling off into dense gray smoke that poured out of the stove joints and filled the small cabin. The ambient air inside her cabin hovered at a miserable 42 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the stove burning constantly. She attempted every standard trick known to frontier homesteaders. She dragged split logs inside and stacked them around the base of her iron hearth, trying to bake out the moisture. She brought kindling into her sleeping quarters. She resplit the larger logs into thin strips, hoping the inner heartwood might be dry. But natural evaporation takes weeks under ambient indoor temperatures, and dragging soaking logs inside brought continuous dampness, humidity, and mold into her living space. Here is the brutal physical reality of burning wet wood that most people never realize. Firewood with a 40 to 50% moisture content spends more than half of its thermal energy simply turning liquid water into steam. Instead of radiating heat into your room, the heat generated by the wood's carbon combustion is consumed by latent heat of vaporization. You burn twice as much timber, generate 10 times the creosote buildup in your chimney, and receive less than 30% of the potential heat output. Sarah calculated her supplies with cold, unforgiving arithmetic. She possessed roughly 6 cords of split wood. At her current rate of burning saturated timber, she would run out of fuel by mid-January. Cutting fresh timber in deep snow was an impossible task for a solo woman caring for 2 young children, and hiring labor was out of the question because her savings had been depleted by funeral expenses and seed costs. She needed her firewood dry. She needed it immediately. And she needed a system that would keep hundreds of cubic feet of fuel completely shielded from rain, wind-driven snow, and ground ice for 5 straight months of winter, where temperatures routinely plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The idea for the double roof envelope structure did not come to Sarah as a moment of artistic inspiration. It came from a cold assessment of her structural limitations. She lacked the time, funds, and draft animals required to build a separate, fully enclosed storage barn. Her nearest neighbor, William Caulfield, had offered to help for a day or two, but he had his own crops to harvest before the ground froze solid, along with a newborn baby in his home. Sarah looked at what she had on hand. She had a mountain lot, filled with standing dead pine, her late husband's felling axes, crosscut saws, broadaxes, and stone chisels. She had a firm grasp of basic timber framing learned from watching Thomas build their cabin. Most importantly, she possessed a deep understanding of natural airflow and thermal movement. She observed something every homebuilder sees, but rarely utilizes. Every time she lit a fire in her hearth, the warm air rose straight to the peak of her cabin ceiling. Because log walls and wooden roof boards are permeable thermal conductors, heat continuously leaked upward out of her living box, escaping harmlessly into the cold autumn sky. That wasted thermal energy was sitting right above her head every single night. That was when the radical concept took shape in her mind. If she could not build a separate barn beside the cabin, she would build a protective frame structure around and over the entire cabin, binding both functions under a single grand roof system. She mapped out the layout using wooden stakes and string. Her original 12 by 16-foot cabin would remain untouched as the inner living core. She would set 8 massive pine posts into deep, gravel-lined post holes, forming an outer rectangular perimeter measuring 24 feet wide by 30 feet long. This design created a continuous 6-foot-wide covered gallery surrounding all 4 exterior walls of her cabin. Overhead, she would frame a steep gable roof spanning 30 feet long and soaring 8 feet above the existing cabin peak. This elevated outer roof would shed winter snow effortlessly while creating a vast, high-volume air chamber above her living quarters. Under this shared upper roof, the 6-foot gallery space along the northern, eastern, and western walls of her cabin would become a massive, sheltered fuel storage yard. She could stack up to 8 cords of firewood directly against the outer log walls of her cabin, protected completely from precipitation by the overhanging eaves of the outer roof structure. Now, consider the physical brilliance of this layout. The stacks of firewood would act as a massive windbreak, shielding her inner cabin walls from cold drafts. Simultaneously, the waste heat escaping through her cabin roof would rise up into the enclosed upper attic space, creating a warm microclimate directly over the wood stacks. That escaping heat would act as a natural, passive timber kiln. The rising warm air would pull moisture out of the surrounding firewood, driving the damp vapor upward and exhausting it out through screened gable vents she planned to cut near the outer roof peaks. Every hour her stove burned to heat her family, it would passively cure and dry the firewood stacked in her gallery, turning wet green logs into dry fuel before she ever picked up an axe to split them. It was an extraordinarily efficient, closed-loop thermodynamic system. Yet, when she picked up her spade on a brisk October morning and began digging the first 8-foot post holes into the rocky Montana soil, her neighbors thought she was suffering from severe mental exhaustion. Her 9-year-old daughter, Mary, stood near the porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching her mother haul 7-inch thick pine logs using a homemade wooden lever system. Mary asked if they were building a new house because their old one was broken. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead, adjusted her grip on the framing timber, and told her daughter that they were not building a house, but a winter coat for the whole home so the firewood would never cry in the fire again. Within 3 days, the main vertical posts were set, tamped tight with crushed riverstone and packed earth. As Sarah began hoisting the heavy horizontal top plates and roof rafters into position using a wooden block and tackle rigged to a nearby pine tree, local traffic along the valley road increased significantly. Settlers traveling to the grist mill slowed their teams to watch a 5-foot 4-inch widow scrambling across high roof timbers in a heavy woolen skirt, securing mortise and tenon joints with oak pegs. The visual proportions of the building looked completely absurd to anyone trained in traditional frontier architecture. From a distance, the structure resembled a massive, bare timber barn frame that had been built directly over a tiny, sunken log cabin. The tiny cabin sat tucked inside like a crate inside a warehouse. There were no outer solid walls yet, just heavy framing posts and a massive towering roof peak hovering high above the original shingles. It violated every established norm of homestead layout. On the frontier, you built a cabin, you built a barn 50 yards away downwind to avoid manure smell and fire risk, and you built an open lean-to for your wood. Combining all three into a nested, double-roofed monstrosity struck local builders as complete lunacy. William Caulfield rode his workhorse into her clearing late one Thursday afternoon. He dismounted, hooked his reins over a fence post, and walked around the perimeter of the framing with a look of quiet disbelief. He watched Sarah notch a rafter plate with a broad axe. William was a good-natured man who had helped Thomas clear land the previous year. He rubbed his chin, looked up at the towering gable roof, soaring 8 feet over her cabin chimney, and asked her gently what in the world she was trying to accomplish. Sarah lowered her axe, stepped down to the lower roof edge, and explained her plan clearly. She showed him how the 6-foot outer gallery would house all 8 cords of her winter firewood along the north and west walls. She explained how the overhead space would capture rising cabin heat to dry out the soaked pine logs she had cut during the rainy autumn. William listened patiently, but Sarah could see the deep skepticism in his eyes. He pointed out that she was expending hundreds of hours of backbreaking labor on a roof structure that offered no additional indoor living space, provided no shelter for draft horses or cattle, and used up enough straight pine timber to build a second full-sized cabin. He told her frankly that if she needed dry wood, she should simply build a small, sloped woodshed 50 feet from her door and cover it with canvas tarps. Sarah shook her head softly. She pointed out that a canvas tarp traps ground moisture underneath, freezes solid in November storms, and forces a person to trek through 3 feet of snowdrifts 20 times a day just to haul logs into the house. In her layout, she could step out of her cabin door directly into a completely dry, sheltered gallery, pick up bone-dry firewood without ever touching snow, and step right back inside. William sighed, patted her shoulder, and admitted that while her logic sounded fine on paper, timber framing exposed to enclosed heat was bound to cause serious problems. He warned her that stacking damp wood in enclosed spaces invites wood rot, powder post beetles, and mold that would rot her cabin walls within 2 seasons. He wished her well, offered to bring over a quarter of butchered beef later that month, and rode away shaking his head. By the first week of November, word of the widow's strange construction project had circulated through every dry goods store, blacksmith shop, and church gathering in the county. The story grew with every telling. In town, men joked that Sarah Hendricks was building an indoor town square for her squirrels. Others speculated that she was losing her mind from the isolation of living on the upper creek without a husband. The criticism reached a sharp peak at the Flathead County Post Office, where Calvin Porter was overseeing the construction of a new timber frame storehouse. Porter was a master carpenter who had spent 20 years building conventional saltbox houses and timber barns across the territory. He was known for his rigid adherence to traditional building techniques and his complete intolerance for unproven DIY innovations. When a couple of local farmers mentioned Sarah's double roof project over a barrel of salted pork, Porter stopped his hammer mid-swing. He turned around, leaned against his workbench, and addressed the entire room in a loud, commanding tone. He announced to everyone present that Sarah Hendricks was not building a winter shelter. She was building a high-capacity fire trap with a rot problem. He explained to the listening farmers that stacking cords of sap-heavy pine directly against the outer log walls of a house enclosed under a common attic space was an absolute violation of basic building safety. One stray ember floating out of her stone chimney, Porter warned, would easily catch in the dry pine needles and wood dust trapped beneath that upper roof shell. The entire structure, outer barn, stored fuel, and inner log cabin would ignite like a massive kiln, trapping the widow and her 2 young children inside a wall of flame before they could ever reach the outer door. Furthermore, Porter argued, if the fire did not kill them, the dampness would. Enclosing wet wood around a heated living cabin, without industrial high-volume ventilation, fans would trap thousands of gallons of evaporating moisture. That trapped steam would condense on the cold underside of her upper roof shakes, raining water back down onto her cabin ceiling, rotting her roof rafters, and creating a breeding ground for black mold that would render the home uninhabitable by spring. His words carried immense weight throughout the community. Porter was the man people hired when they wanted a structure that would stand for 30 years. Within 48 hours, his phrase about Sarah freezing in style had become a popular local joke. Neighbors who had previously considered offering her winter assistance decided to stay clear, convinced that her project was a lost cause, and that local authorities might eventually have to step in and relocate her children before winter set in. Sarah was not deaf to the local gossip. A neighboring farm woman visited her mid-November, bringing a loaf of fresh sourdough bread and a mountain of unsolicited advice. She gently told Sarah what Calvin Porter had said at the post office, urging her to tear down the upper roof frames before heavy snow hit and to move her wood stack 50 yards away from her cabin walls. Sarah stood inside her gallery frame, holding the loaf of warm bread. She listened quietly, without raising her voice or expressing anger. She thanked her neighbor sincerely for the food and the concern. Then she looked her visitor straight in the eye and said that men like Calvin Porter built structures for fair weather and traditional pride, but she was building for thermal survival. She knew her family could not survive on traditional pride when the wind turned northwest, and she intended to finish what she started. By the 3rd week of November, 1881, Sarah had completed the envelope structure entirely by her own hands, using only her husband's hand tools and a block and tackle. The finished build was a sight to behold. The inner 12 by 16-foot cabin sat fully enveloped inside an outer 24 by 30-foot timber shelter. The heavy outer roof was fully shingled with hand-split cedar shakes, sealed tight along the ridge cap with pine pitch and boiled linseed oil. Along the north, west, and east outer galleries, Sarah had neatly stacked 6 full cords of split pine and fir firewood, filling the gallery spaces from the ground all the way up to 6 feet high. The wood was stacked in double-spaced rows, with a 2-inch air gap maintained between the logs and her actual cabin walls, allowing continuous vertical airflow. The south gallery, where her main cabin door faced, was kept clear for easy access, featuring a heavy, hand-slatted outer wooden gate that broke the force of incoming southern gales. At the peak of her outer gable roof, 6 feet above her original cabin chimney, She had constructed two large louvered wooden vents fitted with fine wire mesh. These vents allowed warm, moisture-laden air, rising from the inner chamber to escape continuously into the open atmosphere, without allowing snow, rain, or birds to penetrate the upper attic. From the road, the home looked massive, shadowy, and utterly unconventional. It resembled a giant timber shell hovering over a modest pioneer dwelling. It was raw, unpainted, and strikingly bold. And then, on December 8th, 1881, the great winter of the northern plains arrived with terrifying speed. The storm hit the Bitterroot Valley on December 8th, with a suddenness that caught every settler completely off guard. It began not as snow, but as a soft, eerie drizzle that coated the pine needles in translucent slush. Within 4 hours, the drizzle transformed into a relentless, freezing torrent of rain that fell across western Montana for 3 straight days. Freezing rain is the ultimate nightmare of frontier winter survival. Snow sits lightly on top of structures and can be swept off with a broom. Rain penetrates everything. It seeped into every uncovered woodpile across the territory. It poured into open lean-tos, soaked through canvas tarps, and washed into timber stacks that had spent months drying in the autumn air. It filled the porous grain of split pine, lodgepole, and fir logs with liquid water, freezing into solid ice the moment the rain finally ceased. On the night of December 11th, the sky cleared, and an Arctic cold front roared down from Alberta, Canada. The temperature did not just drop. It plummeted like a lead sinker dropped off a high cliff. It fell from 32 degrees down to 15 above zero by midnight. By dawn on December 12th, the mercury stood at 5 below zero. By the following evening, thermometers across Flathead County read a terrifying 25 degrees below zero, accompanied by 40-mile-per-hour winds that drove the wind chill down past 50 below zero. Across the valley, the winter survival nightmare began in earnest. Families who believed they were fully prepared for winter went outside to gather fuel, only to find their woodpiles transformed into solid blocks of frozen ice and wet timber. At William Caulfield's homestead, 3 miles down the creek, his stacked firewood was frozen together in a monolithic block. He had to take an iron crowbar and a sledgehammer just to break individual logs free from the ice. When he finally forced the waterlogged logs into his cast-iron stove, the result was disastrous. The wet wood hissed like a nest of cornered snakes. Steam poured out of the stove door, filling his cabin living room with an acrid, blinding cloud of gray smoke. His wife wrapped their newborn infant in every woolen blanket they possessed, sitting right next to the hearth where the temperature struggled to reach 44 degrees Fahrenheit. William was forced to burn through nearly a full cord of wood every 4 days, just to keep the indoor water from freezing solid on his kitchen table. Most of the heat energy was being wasted boiling off trapped ice inside the logs rather than warming his family. 3 miles south, at the Morrison homestead, the situation was even grim. Jacob Morrison had stacked his firewood in an open-sided lean-to attached to his barn. The freezing rain had thoroughly saturated his supply, and the subsequent freeze turned his fuel into unburnable ice logs. In utter desperation to keep his 2 young boys warm, Morrison did what dozens of unprepared homesteaders were forced to do during severe cold snaps. He took a handsaw into his own living room and began sawing up his own wooden furniture. He burned 2 pine dining chairs, a kitchen bench, and a handmade oak cabinet door just to generate enough high-temperature flames to dry out a few pieces of wet cordwood for the following night. Cabin chimneys throughout the entire valley poured out thick, heavy white plumes of wet smoke. It was the distinct visual signature of struggling homes, smoldering fires, and waterlogged fuel. Every chimney in Flathead County showed that signature smoke except one. From Sarah Hendricks' chimney, high above her timber envelope roof, there rose a thin, almost invisible ribbon of clear gray smoke. It drifted straight up into the crisp, frozen Arctic sky, dissipating cleanly in the frigid air. It was the unmistakable mark of a high-temperature, complete combustion fire burning bone-dry, cured timber. On the afternoon of December 15th, with the outdoor temperature hovering at 18 degrees below zero, William Caulfield put on his heavy buffalo skin coat, pulled his fur cap down over his ears, and trudged half a mile through knee-deep snowdrifts toward Sarah's property. He was genuinely worried about the widow and her two young children. He knew she was living alone on an exposed ridge, and he feared that her strange double-roof structure might have collapsed under the weight of the ice storm, or that her small stove had failed to keep up with the Arctic cold front. As he cleared the tree line at the edge of her homestead, he stopped dead in his tracks. The sight before him made no sense according to everything he had learned in 20 years of frontier farming. The massive outer envelope structure stood rock-solid against the howling wind. Snow and ice had blanketed the steep cedar shake roof, but the open galleries underneath were completely clear of ice. Sarah was standing in her north gallery, dressed in a simple woolen sweater without a coat, calmly loading logs into a wooden wheelbarrow. She was pulling logs from the top of a 6-foot wood stack that sat entirely protected beneath the upper roof eaves. William approached her, his breath freezing into white icicles on his heavy beard. He called out to her, asking if she and the children were still alive in the cold. Sarah looked up, smiled warmly, and invited him inside for a hot cup of coffee. William stepped out of the freezing gale into her south gallery, opened the inner cabin door, and walked inside. The instant he crossed the threshold, he stopped and took off his heavy buffalo coat in shock. The air inside Sarah's cabin was not just tolerable, it was gloriously, luxuriously warm. The mercury thermometer hanging beside her kitchen window registered 66 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was dry, clear, and fresh, completely free of the choking gray smoke that filled every other cabin in the valley. In the hearth, a modest pine fire burned with an intense, steady golden glow, crackling brightly without a single hiss or drop of moisture. Mary and Samuel were sitting on the floor in front of the stove, playing a game of wooden checkers in their cotton shirts, completely unbothered by the deadly sub-zero storm raging outside their walls. William sat down at the pine table, wrapped his numb fingers around a steaming mug of black coffee, and stared at the stove in disbelief. He asked her straight out how her firewood was dry, when every woodpile between the mountains and the river was frozen solid beneath 2 inches of clear ice. Sarah poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. She explained the exact mechanical process that had taken place over the past 8 weeks inside her structure. Here is what everyone in Flathead County had missed while they were laughing at her building layout. When the 3 days of cold rain hit the territory, Sarah's firewood stack was already shielded beneath a 6-foot overhang and a tight cedar roof. Not a single drop of rain had touched her stored fuel. While her neighbors' wood piles were absorbing hundreds of gallons of rainwater, Sarah's firewood sat completely dry in an elevated, well-ventilated gallery space. Even more crucial was the continuous thermodynamic drying process that had been working non-stop since October. Every single hour that Sarah kept a modest fire burning in her cabin hearth, warm air rose to her inner cabin ceiling. That heat radiated through her ceiling boards into the hollow upper attic space framed beneath her outer roof structure. That trapped warmth created a permanent, low-temperature drying microclimate hovering directly above her stacked firewood. Heat naturally wants to equalize with cold, creating a gentle, continuous upward airflow known as the chimney stack effect. As the escaping cabin heat drifted upward through the gallery spaces, it acted like a giant, low-energy timber kiln. It continuously pulled ambient moisture out of the logs stacked against her outer gallery walls. The damp air rose to the highest peak of the outer roof and escaped harmlessly through the louvered wooden vents she had built into the gable ends. The moisture was driven out of the building before it could ever condense, leaving the wood supply drier by the day. When Sarah went out to gather fuel for her stove, she was not burning green pine or waterlogged cordwood. She was burning wood that had been passively cured by her own home's wasted thermal energy for 60 straight days. While William Caulfield's firewood possessed a moisture content of roughly 45 to 55%, meaning more than half its weight was unburnable liquid water, Sarah's wood had been driven down to a remarkable 12 to 14% moisture content. Now, let that sink in for a moment. A piece of firewood at 14% moisture content ignites in less than 90 seconds when exposed to a match. It burns at a temperature nearly 300 degrees higher than green wood, releasing its full measure of British thermal units directly into the living space. It leaves virtually no unburned carbon, creates zero creosote in the stovepipe, and requires half the volume of wood to generate the exact same room temperature. The math was so startling that William asked her to repeat her fuel consumption numbers twice. During the 7 days of the severe Arctic freeze, William had burned through more than a full cord of wood just to keep his cabin at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah had burned slightly less than 1/3 of a cord over the exact same 7-day period, while keeping her living space 24 degrees warmer than his. Her total wood consumption was less than 70% of what any other homesteader in the territory was burning. The secret was not just in the dry wood. It was also in the extraordinary insulation provided by the stacked firewood surrounding her inner cabin walls. Think about the physics of her layout. On the north, west, and east sides of her cabin, Sarah had stacked 6 cords of dense pine timber 6 feet high against her outer gallery frames, maintaining a 2-inch air gap between the timber and her log walls. That massive wall of stacked timber acted as a multi-ton thermal barrier. It completely blocked the howling sub-zero Arctic winds from ever touching her actual cabin logs. The winds blew against the outer wood stacks, while the air trapped in the 2-inch gap between the wood and her house remained completely still. In building science, dead air is one of the most effective thermal insulators in existence. By surrounding her living core with 6 feet of stacked firewood and a double roof enclosure, Sarah had created a giant thermal flask. Her cabin was no longer exposed to 40-mile-per-hour wind chills. It was resting inside a protected, sheltered buffer zone where the ambient temperature stayed 15 to 20 degrees higher than the open prairie air outside. Her inner log walls were no longer losing heat through convective wind stripping. The heat generated by her iron stove stayed right inside her room, trapped by the surrounding layers of dead air, thick timber, and sheltered space. On December 18, 1881, a second blizzard slammed into the territory. This storm brought 16 inches of heavy snow, followed by 6 continuous days of temperatures staying locked between 20 and 30 degrees below zero. It was the longest sustained period of extreme cold the region had experienced in over a decade. Roads were completely blocked by 4-foot snowdrifts. Supply lines were cut off, and travel between homesteads became nearly impossible. During those 6 brutal days, the survival crisis across Flathead County reached a breaking point. Families ran out of dry kindling. Homes turned into iceboxes. Up on the ridge, however, Sarah Hendricks and her children lived in absolute comfort. Her fire required feeding only once every 8 hours. Before going to bed at night, Sarah would place 2 large, dry pine logs onto a bed of hot coals, damp down the stove draft, and sleep soundly through the night for 8 full hours. When she woke up at 6 in the morning, the cabin air was still a cozy 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the coals in her hearth were glowing hot, ready to ignite a fresh piece of wood in seconds. By contrast, William Caulfield was waking up 3 times every night, shivering in his boots, wrestling with frozen, smoldering ice logs that filled his room with smoke, while his family huddled under 5 layers of quilts. By early January 1882, news of the widow's warm house and unbelievable wood efficiency began spreading across the valley like wildfire. The very settlers who had laughed at her construction project in October were now facing fuel shortages with 2 full months of winter still remaining on the calendar. Jacob Morrison was the first homesteader to swallow his pride and ride up to Sarah's homestead to see the structure with his own eyes. Morrison arrived on a clear, freezing afternoon in mid-January. His face was chapped raw by the wind, and his hands trembled from exhaustion. He had burned through more than 5 cords of wood in 6 weeks, and was down to his last cord of damp timber, facing the real possibility of having to chop down fence posts or burn his wooden barn, siding to keep his children warm through February. He walked into Sarah's gallery, looked at her dry, beautifully cured stacks of wood, and stepped inside her 65-degree living room. He stood near her iron stove for 5 minutes, without saying a single word, absorbing the radiant heat in absolute silence. Finally, Morrison turned to Sarah, looked at her with deep respect, and asked her straight out to explain how she had pulled it off. He admitted frankly that he had mocked her project at the dry goods store in October, calling her outer roof a ridiculous waste of timber. He looked her in the eye and said he was standing there as a humble man who was ready to learn whatever she was willing to teach him. Sarah did not gloat. She did not remind him of his past insults or display an ounce of self-righteousness. She simply poured him a warm cup of chicory coffee, walked him out into her covered gallery, and spent 2 hours walking him through every detail of the design. She showed him the exact spacing of the outer posts, the pitch of the gable roof, the crucial ventilation gaps at the peak that allowed damp air to escape, and the 2-inch dead air gap maintained between the wood stacks and her cabin walls. Morrison listened like a man taking notes for his own life. He reached out and touched the firewood sitting in her stack. It was warm to the touch, light in weight, and bone-dry, ringing with a crisp, clear sound when struck with a knuckle, the universal sign of perfectly seasoned timber. Morrison looked up at the towering upper roof, looked down at the sheltered gallery floor, and shook his head in absolute awe. He asked her if he had permission to copy her design on his own property come spring. Sarah smiled softly and replied that the physics of heat belonged to no single person. It was a gift provided by nature, available to anyone smart enough to stop fighting the elements and start using them instead. By February 1882, 2 more neighboring farmers had visited Sarah's homestead to take precise measurements of her envelope frame. The story of the widow who had outsmarted the worst winter in Montana history reached the ears of Calvin Porter, the master carpenter who had publicly called her project a fire trap with a rot problem. Porter was a proud man, but he was also a master builder who respected hard numbers and structural reality above all else. He rode out to Sarah's homestead under the pretense of inspecting her chimney clearance for fire safety. He brought along a set of measuring tapes, a draft gauge, and a timber inspection chisel. He spent 3 hours examining every single corner of her double roof structure. What Porter discovered thoroughly destroyed every objection he had raised at the post office 3 months earlier. First, he inspected her cabin roof timbers for evidence of moisture condensation and mold, the rot problem he had predicted so confidently. He found the roof boards completely bone dry. The louvered gable vents she had installed at the outer roof peak were working with flawless efficiency, drawing warm, moist air up and out of the building before it could ever settle or cool on the timber surfaces. Second, he examined her firewood stacks for signs of decay, pest infestation, or excessive heat buildup. The wood was clean, pristine, and thoroughly cured, sitting in an environment that actively prevented rot rather than promoting it. Finally, he checked her stone chimney clearance, where it passed through the outer upper roof. Sarah had framed a generous 12-inch clearance around the stone masonry, lining the timber opening with non-combustible riverstone slate and thick clay mortar. There was 0 scorch damage, 0 creosote accumulation, and 0 fire risk. Calvin Porter stood in the snow outside her south gallery for a long time, looking at the frame with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He walked up to Sarah, who was sweeping light powder snow off her entry steps. Porter took off his hat in the sub-zero air, looked her dead in the eye, and admitted that he had been entirely wrong. He stated publicly that her envelope structure was the single most brilliant piece of functional folk engineering he had ever encountered in his 20 years of building across the western frontier. He told her that she had solved a problem that had plagued northern builders for a century, and that he intended to build similar envelope roofs for 3 of his wealthiest clients the following autumn. Spring of 1882 arrived in the Bitterroot Valley like a triumphant relief after months of relentless frozen siege. As the thick ice on the rivers cracked and melted under the March sun, homesteaders emerged from their cabins to take stock of their winter losses. Many families were left physically exhausted, financially drained, and severely short of wood. Hundreds of fence rails had been chopped down and burned as emergency fuel. Wooden outbuildings had been stripped of their planks, and families had suffered through weeks of shivering in smoky, drafty rooms. Yet, when the county road cleared and settlers began driving their wagons past the Hendricks property again, they saw Sarah's home sitting untouched, solid, and pristine. Her 6 cords of firewood had lasted through the entire winter, with more than 2 full cords of bone-dry timber still remaining stacked in her north gallery. Her cabin roof had suffered 0 rot damage, her children were healthy and energetic, and her livestock shed remained fully intact. The numbers from that winter of 1881 and 1882 told a story that no builder or farmer in Montana could deny. The numbers do not lie. While conventional homesteads had burned through 5 to 7 cords of wet timber just to maintain room temperatures between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Sarah had burned only 2.5 cords while maintaining a steady indoor climate between 62 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. She had used less than half the fuel, produced 90% less creosote in her chimney, and enjoyed an indoor temperature nearly 20 degrees warmer than anyone else in the valley. Word of her success spread rapidly from farm to farm, carried by word of mouth, pioneer letters, and local carpenters. By late summer of 1882, a massive building transformation began taking place across western Montana. Homesteaders who had chuckled at Sarah's strange double roof during the previous autumn were now busy felling standing dead pine to build their own timber frame envelope structures before the next freeze arrived. Jacob Morrison was the first to complete his build in August of 1882. He constructed a modified pole frame version over his existing woodshed and south cabin wall, extending a 6-foot roof canopy that created a dry storage envelope for 4 cords of firewood. By keeping his fuel completely dry under a shared eave and utilizing his cabin's radiant heat, Morrison cut his wood consumption in half during the following winter of 1882 and 1883. Another nearby pioneer family, the Hohensons, adapted Sarah's concept into a 3-sided wraparound structure attached directly to their main living quarters. They lined the inner walls with stacked cedar logs, creating a double-walled thermal barrier that cut cold draft infiltration by nearly 70%. William Caulfield spent the entire autumn of 1882 building a full structural envelope over his larger frame house, framing a magnificent upper gable roof with louvered end vents that mimicked Sarah's exact ventilation ratios. Even the local blacksmith got involved in the movement. He designed a simple, dual-metal moisture indicator, a crude mechanical gauge made of 2 iron and brass strips that contracted at different rates when exposed to wood moisture. Homesteaders could press the device against a split log to determine whether the wood had cured down to 15% moisture content before bringing it indoors to burn. By the autumn of 1883, just 2 years after Sarah had sunk her first 8 post holes into the frozen earth, 14 families within a 50-mile radius had constructed variations of her double-roof envelope design. In some parts of the county, settlers referred to the technique as the Hendricks double roof. In other areas, carpenters called it an envelope storage gallery or a thermal wrap barn. The name did not matter. The fundamental physics remained unchanged. Keep the wood completely dry. Harness your living home's escaping heat to dry your fuel passively. Build a thermal dead air buffer around your living walls, and never allow winter winds to strip heat from your home. Calvin Porter, the master carpenter who had initially mocked Sarah at the post office, became one of the biggest advocates of the envelope design in the territory. In 1883, Porter was hired by 4 wealthy ranch owners to build full double-roof timber envelopes over their ranch headquarters. He never made a grand public speech apologizing to Sarah, but late one October afternoon in 1883, as he rode his horse past her property on his way to a framing job, he pulled his reins, stopped in the clearing, lifted his wide-brimmed hat high in the air, and bowed his head in quiet respect. Sarah, who was sitting on her south gallery porch, knitting a woolen sweater for her son, looked up and nodded back with a calm, gentle smile. That simple gesture was all the recognition she ever needed. Sarah Hendricks was not an architect, an engineer, or a trained carpenter. She was simply a widowed mother who could not afford to be wrong when the life of her children hung in the balance. And because she could not afford to be wrong, she looked past traditional pride, ignored the ridicule of her neighbors, and listened to the unforgiving laws of physical science instead. She understood that heat rises, water destroys combustion efficiency, dead air insulates, and nature does not bend to human arrogance. The structure she framed in the autumn of 1881 was born of pure necessity, but it produced an architectural technique that saved dozens of families from freezing during some of the harshest winters in American frontier history. Here is why this historic pioneer story matters so much to us today. The physical principles that kept Sarah Hendricks warm through the terrible blizzard of 1881 are just as powerful today as they were over a century ago. Whether you are heating an off-grid cabin with a wood stove, building an energy-efficient homestead, preparing for emergency winter grid failures, or simply trying to optimize your modern home fireplace, Sarah's lessons remain absolute. Moisture is the single greatest enemy of thermal energy. Burning wood with high moisture content wastes more than half of your fuel's potential heat, clogs your chimney with dangerous creosote, and fills your living space with toxic smoke. By implementing passive drying microclimates, maintaining proper vertical airflow, protecting your fuel from precipitation, and building dead air insulation buffers around your living spaces, you can double your heating efficiency while burning a fraction of the wood. Never let the mockery of traditional minds stop you from applying sound physical logic to solve the real problems in front of you. When her neighbors laughed at her backwards barn, Sarah did not argue or defend her pride. She simply kept driving wooden pegs into her framing joints, knowing that when the winter wind roared down from the mountains, the thermometer would deliver the final verdict. Her neighbors built for appearance and tradition. She built for survival. If this story of early American frontier ingenuity earned your respect, and if you can see yourself applying these timeless survival principles in your own modern life, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment down below, telling us where you are watching from, and sharing your own experiences with wood heating, off-grid building, or severe winter weather. Every single week, we bring you another tested technique from history that kept people alive when a single mistake meant death. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific dramatized events are fictionalized, while the technical building concepts, thermodynamic principles, and survival methods discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical knowledge. Any modern construction or heating application should always be evaluated according to current building codes, local safety guidelines, and proper professional standards. Stay warm, stay smart, and remember that sometimes the absolute best survival solution is the one everyone laughs at until the blizzard hits.